Senior Lecturer at the Division of Landscape Architecture.
And I am Ivan Valin. I'm an Associate Professor of Practice in the division as well.
So as part of our exhibition and archive for living materials, which is currently shown at PMQ, and to reflect on our joint research initiative, Ivan and I have invited 4 experts tonight to talk about the material-based approaches. And before we start this conversation, I would like to briefly introduce TAL-L as a project. The Taxon Archive Lab Library is an interactive and open-ended resource for students, teachers, and practitioners in landscape. It originates from a cycle of material research and experimentation in landscape architecture. So the goal of this project is to expand practical and theoretical discourse on local natural and anthropogenic material resources. And within TAL-L, we established a structure to investigate materials, which is first through a taxon, which is an array of specific physical, chemical, and performative properties, which we give to each sample. And we store and collect and digitize material resources through an archive. And last but not least, we encourage material experimentation with material design through a lab. And earlier this year, we have already launched a digital platform, which is documenting local materials and related material experiments. You will see the link in the chat box, and that homepage gives you some more information about the project as well. This resource we consider as novel in landscape architecture and also an opportunity for us to oppose standardization of a constructed environment. And we would like to reframe our understanding of materials as we see it today by building new connections between landscape, architecture, environment, and nature.
So before I introduce the panel, maybe I could ask if the panelists can turn on their cameras, because I don't think we can see you yet. We're going to introduce the panelists in a minute. Matthew, Lidia, Man, hopefully you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I don't know why I can't open the videos and then you can see my face, because it says that I need to get your approval to show my face. I don't know why.
Okay, we'll work on that in a second.
Okay, we're working on that.
Got it. These things never begin without some technical difficulties, and we didn't do a warm-up first, so. Good. So Susie and I have convened this discussion as a way of concluding the exhibit at PMQ and then pivoting towards the next project of TAL-L, which will be an incubator for material innovation focused on hands-on material research for students and involving experimentation, fabrication, and material specialists from within the region. Today, we're hoping to frame this material agenda within a wider context of landscape theory, research, teaching, and basically take the practicality, the mundane material product, whether it's soil, bricks, steel, glass, and then engage from those materials, actually engage ideas of landscape ethics, sustainability, agency, pedagogy, and practice. Our guests today, and we were going to have 4, but someone just has called in sick, so we have 3 guests today. Our guests are each doing their own innovative work in a part of the field that overlaps with the interests of the lab, with the TAL project. So let me introduce our guests. First up, and at the crack of dawn in the United States, joining us is Matthew Siebert, an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Matthew's research and teaching engage in one-to-one design methodologies and representation, and he challenges dominant forms of knowledge production through his situated fieldwork and his critical cartography. Matthew's new book for Routledge is called Atlas of Material Worlds, Mapping the Agency of Matter for a New Landscape Practice. It's a rich visual, textual addition to the project of new materialism and a great addition to the landscape architecture canon.
Okay. Our second panelist today is Tsang. Thank you so much for joining from Poly. Man is the manager of the Material Resource Center at the School of Design in Hong Kong Polytechnical University, a library which opened in 2014 and collects more than 2,500 advanced materials across different industries. So Man's background is actually in fashion design. And you have worked in fashion design for over 10 years, right?
Yeah.
But now she's curating the library with a lot of attention to exploring the possibilities of the materials through lectures and exhibitions and several workshops. So we really just skipped our fourth panelist a minute ago. So I will also introduce Lidia Ratoi. Hello, thank you for joining us. Lidia is an assistant professor here at the Department of Architecture at HKU, and she holds degrees both in architecture and robotic fabrication. And in her research, she investigates material ecology and sustainability within the realm of robotic fabrication. Her current project, called Impossible Bricks, linking to Impossible Meat, I guess, mediates the use of bioplastic and materials paired with robotic fabrication, and aiming to deviate the interaction of nature and technology. Very happy to have you guys here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, welcome, welcome. We were supposed to be originally in the room where we have the exhibit, but we're actually in a green studio. But what's on the walls is our exhibition. I want to acknowledge the funding source for much of this research, which is a grant from the University of Hong Kong, Teaching Development Grant, which is aimed at building up student resources and knowledge. And so in addition to the Teaching Development Grant, I want to thank the PMQ Galleries for hosting us, and the Department of Architecture and the Division of Landscape Architecture for their resources in supporting Susie and I for this work. I want to also especially thank Ceci Wong, who's a co-curator of the project at the PMQ, and a very great research assistant for the project. Shall we kick off into some questions? So
yes, I would say so.
The idea of the kind of structure that we've set up for today, it's a pretty short 1-hour talk. We're going to kick off some questions to the panel as a way to get the conversation started. We'll continue with discussion, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for audience questions. Since we're missing one guest, I think our panelists can spend a little bit more time on the opening question answers if they like. Good. Okay. Is that a sound I need to pay attention to? Hopefully not. Okay. So Matthew, we chose you to start first. In your new book, you speak of a need to appreciate material agency as it permeates through our social world, our physical world. You talk about this idea of material practice in your introduction as not a kind of technical proficiency, but as a kind of ethical imperative. The tools and methods that you talk about in the book and in your work at UVA explore many scales from kind of the site scale all the way up to kind of global scale of material movement. And you work through acts of both cartography, but also, I think, ethnographic methods in the work. This is a broad question, but how do you, in such a complex, situating the work in such a complex body of theory and work, how do you embed these ideas, these concepts in your work as a landscape educator, especially since we've moved online kind of in the last couple of years, and students kind of don't often get that experience in the physical world?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, first of all. And I want to preface anything I say with, if anything's sort of a lack of clarity, it's due to the fog of sleep, as Ivan mentioned. I literally just woke up about 15 minutes ago, but really happy to be here and excited about the conversation. And yeah, I mean, excellent question. I mean, it's definitely not easy to kind of bring these ideas to both practice and teaching, especially as you mentioned, we're increasingly, part of the Zoom world as we are now. But ultimately, I mean, really, in sort of my pedagogy, well, a lot of it currently is about kind of bringing students back to the land, back to the physical. So it's kind of facilitating the cultivation of land relations. Particularly, I think what's important is doing that over kind of meaningful durations of time. And so this is kind of largely been through kind of in situ field work at what we're sort of developing at UVA called the Milton Land Lab, which is this access to essentially 172 acres of a former airfield. But I mean, I also kind of bring this through digital means, kind of utilizing real-time simulation. And maybe I can speak about that a bit more later. But as you mentioned in my book, really the idea is to kind of, argue for a heightened attunement to kind of these unique, hidden, and often hidden influence, or I should say unique, ubiquitous, and often hidden influence of non-living materials on our everyday lives. And this is a power practice that can be gained by designers and non-designers alike. I mean, the book is largely kind of focused towards more of the a field of design, but it is written, at least most of the chapters are written in a way of kind of engaging a more popular or general audience. And so, as I was mentioning, I mean, how I kind of bring this back to teaching currently is not so much of the strategies I use in the book, which is largely sort of cartographic imagery, as well as kind of first person sort of ethnography or narrative, as a way to kind of bring the audience to these oftentimes distant landscapes. But in teaching, it's really about bringing them to the landscape that we have immediate access to. And as I mentioned, what we have sort of the best access to as far as being able to kind of even intervene in the landscape is this former airfield. And before as an airfield, I mean, it obviously was used by the indigenous people of this area, and then Jefferson came in and is largely sort of agricultural. So there is this deep history of disturbance, which is quite ripe for engagement through landscape practice. And I mean, it's, as I was mentioning, it's particularly sort of special because whereas an architecture school kind of usually has a fabrication lab or an ability to sort of engage with largely static media, this land lab, as we've christened it, affords students and researchers alike a space to kind of intervene and manipulate and observe the lively material landscape itself. And I mean, this obviously sort of clearly ventures into the living as well, whereas the focus of my book is a bit more on kind of the agency of non-living, which I think is a harder kind of concept for people to grasp oftentimes. But at the site, we really focus on sort of the relational assemblages between the living and non-living. And so much of the content is kind of oriented around the dynamics of kind of deep time of geology, or really even the generative powers of kind of a hydrology. One of the eastern boundaries of the site is a river, and then even regenerative disturbance events like fire. And as I was saying too, I kind of teach two courses there currently. One is kind of a core course for our curriculum called sort of ecology and technology. That's a bit more about the technical side of landscape architectural practice. But I've also been 2 years now, I've taught an advanced research studio out there as well, which has really been quite fruitful in engaging that site in a much more, I don't know, creative way. And so the first course, I mean, it's kind of anchored around this idea or this theme of regenerative systems, where half the time students are actually out there on the site. And so the class is, 3.5 hours every week. So it's a really wonderful opportunity to have them kind of understand this landscape over a semester. In this case, it's the fall. And so they get to see this change of from summer to winter, essentially. And they perform a number of kind of technical studies and kind of working towards a sort of ecological and cultural resources assessment to inform a final regenerative design proposal. And this, I mean, so that this is done sort of in a lot of different ways, from kind of field work and sort of ecological surveys, referencing historical maps, even using sort of drone photography and photogrammetry to develop kind of their own mappings, taking soil cores, and we've even been able to participate in a prescribed fire of a remnant old grassland there. But again, all this is ultimately designed to facilitate kind of the building relationship with the land. Again, it kind of oriented around this idea of kind of developing a sort of more robust personal sort of concept of land relations. And that's taken further with the studio, where they have a lot more time and a lot more sort of creative freedom to explore their own interests. Where the studio frames the site as kind of a mesocosm, a scientific concept of kind of a middle scale between the highly controlled and small scale generally of a sort of laboratory experiment, and on the other end of that is sort of the rather large scale and lack of control of sort of a general field survey. So it sits somewhere in the middle, which is pretty interesting, but ultimately kind of asking students to investigate alternative ways of knowing that begin to challenge kind of Western empiricism and scientism, believing that science is kind of the only answer in a way, or the way that science can sort of solve everything, but really cultivate alternative worldviews and ways of being to kind of meet this rapidly shifting world. And so we work through a number of different ways of knowing, from kind of the science of surveying to the sort of land art of registering environmental phenomenon. We use sort of a LiDAR mapping device to kind of use it to work through the technology of imaging, the understanding of how to design an experiment, ultimately then how to engage others through participatory action research, or another way for the project to kind of communicate that relationship with the land to others. And so again, I mean, I guess just kind of close my opening response here. I mean, the book is trying to develop this idea of a material practice through largely kind of remote means, through essentially storytelling, basically both with graphics as well as narrative and text. But my teaching currently is really trying to bring students to the actual landscape. And I'm always surprised how many landscape architecture students aren't sort of experienced outside in a way. Oftentimes they don't even want to go outside, which is kind of interesting, but to get them out from behind the computer and actually working with the materiality and the media of landscape itself.
Good. It sounds like that last comment is something we definitely face in Hong Kong. We'll continue with a couple other questions, but definitely want to circle back around to that idea of the kind of the mesocosm and how you bring feedback into the design process, specifically material feedback and systems feedback.
Yep, I think what leads us a little bit to what we would like to discuss with Man, is the notion you started, Matthew, about the access to materiality and the access to the landscape. Yeah. Well, to students, but also you mentioned that when you talked about your book to sort of a general public, and how do you see, understand, assess landscapes? And obviously, Man is curating this relatively large library for a Hong Kong scale. In that context, which you already have also mentioned to Matthew, our own research in TAL really starts with a hunch that, despite being in a region where we have abundant material resources, and we live in a time where we talk about sustainability and the environment, and in Hong Kong there is a lot of support, like from government and also private clients, to build and look at materials in a sustainable way. And despite of that, when you look around in Hong Kong, pretty much all landscapes, or if we bracket out landscape and say materials, actually look more common, more standard, and imported, right? And I think that is a sort of a big thing we are looking at into sort of this question of how do we source our materials and how do we track that? And that would be something I would like to discuss with Man, because your material library looks partially at sort of global material innovation, but also looks partially at really local materials, right? And new material resources. How do you keep up with these things, and how do you contextualize these resources? Such as, for instance, part of your library is this co-curated by Material Connection, right, which is a worldwide material database. And how do you see Hong Kong locally in that context?
Thank you for your invitations, and then let me talk about the Material Resources Center in the School of Design. Yeah, I give you some background for about the Material Resources Center. We subscribe the Material Connections. As you know, we have 2,500 materials here, but as you know that all the material is from the worldwide. If for the students, and maybe for some architecture students, it's difficult to get the material. So in the last year, our center start to collect some the local material from the Hong Kong and the mainland China. It's mainly from the mainland China, because the students can easily to get it. And as you say that now we let the Material Connections as a trend inductor, I would say that they will give the students inspirations, and then maybe for their project they will know the technique and then all the things, and then they will know the trend. But in fact, we will also see some and other material forecasting websites such as the WGSN, because they also have the interior and also have some product design things, and they have the trade show, and we will sort these materials and then to find the new materials to get into our local material studios. So now, and our local materials have over the 1,000 items, and we divided some categories and like as the Material Connections, because we also need to base on the Material Connections to set up the local materials to something like to sing together. Yeah, because such as the Material Connection is the upgrade, and then we have the local materials to help the students how to connect how to use the local material to achieve the high levels standards. Yeah, or something like that. Yeah.
This is an interesting point I think you're raising, because for us also the question is, what are these standards, right? And where do we get them from? How do we look at comparative standards, or what is really sort of the value of working with local materials? And I think what you mentioned, sort of that inspiration you students are getting from a larger resource. Do you think they can find comparative materials, such as, like if you look into architectural materials shown in Material Connection, which they keep their database quite updated, right? So
yeah.
they basically update every month. In your experience, do you think students are able to find resources, you say mostly in mainland China, if we say, okay, a lot of the architecture materials and specifically are sourced in the Greater Bay Area. Do you think, or in your experience, can students find these materials locally if they get the inspiration from the more global resources?
I think that in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong students quite difficult to find the architecture materials. Maybe to make their prototype and all the things, but they can get the material in China. And for this one have another problems, because we don't have the centralized, I would say the database about the China architecture materials. not even for the architecture, often for the product design and other things. They will have Alibaba or and something, yeah. But it's also difficult to find the right the right factory to give you the right materials. You need to search, you need to find. So my job is to skip out some not the I will say that to skip out some bad quality materials, and then collect they have a cert, and then maybe they have a good quality, and I will stay in our local materials library, and then the students will easily to get it. And now we will try to group the China factory contact together, and then it's mean that I will talk to the China factory, and then they will say that, oh, okay, they can provide the material to the students, maybe sponsor them, and then all the things, and then we will keep the list, and then it's mean that the students can easily to get it. But if we don't have the list and the contact, and I don't think the student or the designer can easily to get it. Yeah.
Maybe one last short question to you, Man, before we move on. How do you assess the quality of the materials you're sourcing?
Yeah, we will. They have a cert, and also they can keep the quality, something like the cert at the spec, and also if they have the lab tests and all the things, I will keep it. Yeah, if they don't have this one, I will try to I will ask them to give us some samples, and then to our lab library, yeah, to test. Because now, for example, now we have a Hong Kong wood library later, and then we will collect some Hong Kong wood, and then send to our industrial center to make some tests, something like the strengthen test and all the things. Yeah, okay. I will try to make this one. Yeah.
So you work with local laboratories, and maybe that's a sort of a thank you a lot for your answers. That's a good transition to look into Lydia's work, because you, Lidia, you also work a lot with testing, and you explored that idea of novel material assemblages as an open-ended process, as far as I understand your work, that reveals behavior and variability, rather than really sort of a direct process with specific outcomes, right? And I think that's where I would like to transition, looking really at sort of Man's work. She says, okay, we are sourcing these materials, they have to suit a specific or specifications. There are lab tests, there is ways which streamline these processes, right? Your work, Lidia, is more open-ended. You pay attention to more unexpected phenomena, and you look into emergent properties of technologically mediated forms of making. And that connects obviously to a longer tradition of crafts in architecture. And my question to you would be, traditionally, there is a resistance to sort of scaling up that idea of craft or architectural production. But now robotics actually, the idea of robotics touches upon exactly that. And do you consider scale and reproducibility in the ambitions of your work? And if you do so, which I guess you do, what are some of the pathways for iteration and variation and accident in your work?
Yes, there are definitely two issues that I consider, but I think my answer would be a little bit less black and white. So maybe I can address the issue separately, because I had to kind of mediate them separately when I was doing my work. And I think the issue of scale in architecture, and when dealing with robotic fabrication, when working with new materials, is really vital, because the workflow is kind of completely new. We don't really have an established methodology. We need to develop our own empirical processes. So I think it's important as an architect to work at an architectural scale, but I think it's even more important to be flexible in our understanding of scale, an understanding of what architectural design and building is, because in the past 20 years or so, 15, 20 years, our flexibility came from being open to form, to computational design techniques. And I think right now, this flexibility comes from how and what we design. And we have to rethink about this. And I wanna address here the issue of anthropomass, because as of 2020, we officially live in a world that's more our making than of nature's making. There's more anthropomass than biomass. And I think here is where the issue of scale comes from, treating the built environment and the existing buildings as territory to build upon, and that we can add sustainable behavior to, rather than creating workflows which require either that we demolish or we build from scratch and we take up even more space from the natural environment. So in my most recent projects, I'm working only with existing built conditions, and I'm offering new behavior through materiality, through participatory workflows, of course, for geometric manipulation. And I think this becomes more as healing the existing fabric rather than trying to replace it with a completely new one. But in terms of reproduction, I prefer to steer away from mass customization techniques, from kind of detached computational design workflows that can be applied worldwide, because I think design, and especially built design, should address local society issues, local available materials. And I think this quality of unexpected comes from working with instances that you discover spontaneously on site, and of course through a very, very hands-on process by working directly with the material, with the robot or whatever tool you're using. And actually in my work, I very rarely downwrite the proportions of the bioplastic mixes that I'm experimenting with, mostly deviated from food waste. I always mix them with my own hands because I want to see how they behave, and just through the experience of working with the robot for quite a few years, I kind of know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And even though maybe I don't use the robot, but if I cast it, it's just somehow the hand become more intelligent. And this is because when you work with biomaterials, there's so many little things that can vary, like the humidity in the room, the temperature in the room, how old is the waste that you're trying to turn to bioplastic, the specificities of your robot. So I really think it's impossible to have one recipe developed somewhere in the world and hope it can be completely applicable somewhere else. But I do want to mention that I don't think that only bioplastics are biomaterials. I think reused materials like wood or even concrete can be sustainable materials if you reuse them. And I think we're really afraid of plastic, but we have to kind of accept that it's here to stay. Plastic never really fully decomposes, and it's actually an intelligent material if it's used to its proper properties. Plastic is developed for a very long life cycle, so it's only a damaging material when it's used in small scale and when it's used for temporary objects. So I think rather than making so much effort to try to deny it and replace it, we could simply recycle and reuse it. So I really think it's important to discover new materials, but also new ways of using the existing ones. And I think something that I learned from the beginning when I started doing this type of research to now is to kind of succumb more to nature. In the beginning, when I was 3D printing, when I was using a robot, I really felt this pressure to be very precise, to build something that is, let's say, as good as previous construction methods. And I was really bothered by any crack, any imperfection I would consider now a flaw. But now I see things very differently. Actually, a colleague of mine said something very beautifully recently, and I think she's actually very right. that we consider natural phenomena a trauma that happens to us and to architecture. We really treat natural occurrences as a trauma. And I want to come back here to my original idea of flexibility, my initial idea. I think we have to also be more flexible in the way that we live if we really want material ecology to make a difference in terms of long-term sustainability. Feeling a bit warm, feeling a bit cold, not using the AC, being a bit uncomfortable, having non-human forms of life occupying our space. They're really not traumas. They shouldn't be completely avoided or denied. We lived through these instances for thousands of years. And I think we can really learn from indigenous architecture that proved there's a balance between living with nature while also being protected from the harsher sides of nature. So I think as architects, it's really time that we look at the different types of references, that we look at indigenous architecture like the one in Cappadocia or Machu Picchu or Haran, rather than looking and trying to keep learning from modernist architecture, from contemporary architecture, because that's a type of architecture that really enables this human-centric type of process, which I think it's about time that we move away from.
Mm-hmm. I think there is a very interesting component in your reply, which I actually would like to give that back to Matthew. The way you talk about living materials, right? So our exhibition, which you can see in the background at the moment, is called An Archive for Living Materials. And I think as per classification, or as per common classification, we do have a lot of materials in there, which a lot of people would not classify as living, as in soil samples, like completely decomposed granite would be not a living material. But we sort of refuse really to classify it as that, because it is changing, it is evolving over time. And I think that relates a little bit back to how you are talking, that we have to accept that the materials around us, like same with the bioplastic, right? It behaves differently in different contexts. Like for example, in our exhibition, we had materials which we had in one location for a long time, and they were all fine. And then we moved it to the exhibition venue, and within 3 days, they were all green and molding. So I think there has to be, it's living, right? So there has to be this acceptance of how do we deal with this idea of living materials. I don't know, maybe Matthew can respond to that in a way to how do you see that in your book or in your own work? Because you also extensively talk about field work, right? And this idea of bringing students out to an evolving environment.
Yeah, no, I mean, great question. And I mean, yeah, I guess in some ways, even just the, I don't know, binary categorization of living and non-living does us a disservice, right? But it's, yeah, I actually gave a talk to this environmental humanities group, I guess that was a few weeks ago, and they brought up the sort of term of non-living, and if that is actually kind of like the right term. And no, it's not. It's definitely not. Because again, the argument I'm trying to make, even these sort of scientifically inanimate objects such as sand or certain components of soil are technically not alive, but the argument I'm trying to make is that they still exhibit a certain agency that is still a certain sort of liveliness, as Jane Bennett might kind of argue, and she even says that, and Jane Bennett, sort of this theorist that has written this great book, Vibrant Matter, essentially on this idea of new materialism, kind of the agency of material. But I mean, she even says that it's not necessarily bad to anthropomorphize these other kind of materials, and that actually gives us a greater ability to kind of wrap our heads around their power, their sort of liveliness. And it's true. I mean, these materials, I mean, you mentioned sort of decomposed granite, and my book goes through a number of seemingly banal materials from these contributing authors that orient chapters around a particular material, such as sand or mud or clay. Again, these rather sort of what we might think of lifeless materials, but they tell these really rich stories of kind of the power that they have on our lives in different capacities. And I've written about lithium, which is a sort of singular element that we sort of extract from sort of these minerals and environments throughout the world, mostly in Chile and Australia these days, Western Australia. But lithium plays a role in our mental health. So it's a sort of a physiological response. We need a sort of trace quantity of it to kind of retain a sort of balanced psychology. It also plays a tremendous role in our sort of digital lifestyles. I mean, pretty much any mobile device that has a battery is going to be using sort of the material propensities of lithium, this ability to sort of hold a high energy density. And so again, I think this idea of kind of recognizing that these propensities, these powers, this liveliness, this agency, whatever you want to call it, to understand that our environment is more than humans, obviously, more than even sort of other living beings that might be a bit more charismatic. But it just expands into kind of all the material around us, that it has a sort of life behind it as well, which there's a lot of, I think Lidia mentioned some kind of indigenous ways of thinking have recognized this, for centuries, if not much longer than that. And I do think it's time that we begin to try to cultivate an expanded way of kind of thinking about the materials around us. And there's certainly been some other theorists that have done this. I mean, Donna Haraway and her idea of the Thulucene and this symbiosis, or this making with. I mean, Anna Tsang and sort of the kind of arts of living on a damaged planet. There's also Robin Kimmerer, who's a plant ecologist that also has a sort of indigenous background, who calls for sort of mutualism between sort of scientific ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, or indigenous knowledge systems. So it's not about Western empiricism versus kind of indigenous science. That they both have kind of advantages to offer, and there's this mutualism between the two that can be much more productive than one or the other in isolation. But again, ultimately, it's kind of expanding how we think about kind of the environment around us, both living and non-living.
Mm.
And that's sort of today, when we talk about like an archive or a kind of specification library, there's a kind of recognition among some of the scholars you mentioned, other scholars like Jane Hutton, that sort of argue that there needs to be a much more deep way of understanding the impact of different materials on their environment, on communities, on short-term and long-term timeframes. Inevitably, like because we're talking about living materials, we're talking about materials as continuum. Inevitably, it's impossible to kind of capture that those true properties. So, what's exciting about Lidia's work and Matthew's work is in the classroom and in their own research is how you try to embody that knowledge just in the process of working with students or working with robots, mixing the materials yourself. It kind of makes me think of landscape architecture. The use of materials in many forms is more of a kind of recipe making, right? As a kind of mixing, especially in landscape architecture than in something where we're applying fixed materials to fixed structures on fixed foundations, but we're working more fluidly. And I like when you talk about this kind of experimentation or this feedback on site as a way to inform that process, if not to write about it in a kind of specification sheet, but at least to gain the experience of it.
Yeah, I guess what you mentioned, this idea of experience and fabrication, and I guess both of you have referred to this idea of learning from indigenous knowledge, or trying to link this idea of material recipes into our practice, if I want to like say it really briefly. Now, all of you have sort of that context of really working in Hong Kong. Maybe before we open up the panel to questions from the audience, very quick response from all of you. What's the next material practice, or what's emerging in Hong Kong? What should be emerging in Hong Kong?
And we secretly know Matthew was here in Hong Kong for at least a part of his.
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago. Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly say something so I can hand it over to the others who probably have much more to say about this than me. Well, I mean, yeah, first of all, I don't know what should happen in Hong Kong. It's been a long time since I've been there, and I was only there for a summer. But I guess one thing I would like to sort of call attention to, I think this is an interesting idea of kind of, the material recipe. And what I'd say is, I think what's an incredibly important ingredient to that recipe, or several ingredients, is from the sort of sociocultural side. So it's not just the materiality, but it's how it interacts with a particular group of people or culture. And so this is also what I try to work on both in my book and my teaching, is this idea of kind of, as Ivan was mentioning, feedback, or what I oftentimes describe as sort of correspondence, which is well, I take it from anthropologist Tim Ingold's concept of correspondence, or the setting up of a relation with the world, commonly sort of by thinking through making, whether that's art, religion, food, architecture, etc. But I think it's really important to understand that this idea of kind of the material performance and the recipe of that is really, it's really important to understand sort of the cultural side and how people kind of relate to that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Hong Kong, actually, there's a lot of opportunity in two directions. One that says, let's say, more the positive opportunity, in the sense that the climate allows for a lot of let's say wiggle room, because you don't have to deal with a lot of seasons. We basically have one season, and it rains or it doesn't rain, more or less. But that's the only variation, more or less the only variation we have in climates. And of course, there's the accessibility to state-of-the-art technology. So in this sense, I think Hong Kong has the potential to become a sustainable city. But then there's also, let's call it the negative opportunity. There's not really a lot of work done with sustainable, a lot of applied work done with sustainable construction methods, with sustainable materials. Hong Kong is an urbanized city. It's not necessarily what you would think of a sustainable city, but because it's so obviously not sustainable, it's really easy to argue for a change. It's very obvious that we need this change. It's one of the most wasteful cities in the world. So again, there's a lot of opportunity to source this waste. Yes, it's not good that we create so much, but rather than focusing on criticizing, or more or less complaining about it, what if we use all this waste? We have basically an abundance of material because there's so much waste. And just from my own work, I discovered that about 40% of the waste comes from the food industry. And food waste is actually a very good source of harvesting material. It can be easily repurposed, food waste. But there's also a lot of plastic waste, which if we leave it if we try to get rid of it, there's not really a lot of chances of that. Plastic never fully decomposes. But if we find ways of also reusing this plastic, of using basically as a bioplastic and using it with different technologies, I think 3D printing is really giving a lot of opportunity to reuse plastic. In these senses, I think actually we are at the crossroads. The status quo right now is not the best, but I think we have a very strong argument, and a lot of different types of research in town that are trying to change the status quo.
Yeah.
Man, what do you think?
Yeah, and in my point of view, now every designer and the students come to the MRC and ask for, do you have any sustainable materials in trend and all the things, and then I can do it in my project and then for my homework. And because for this one, our professor Brian Lee have already made archive. It's called the eco materials, and he collected all the eco material from Hong Kong and the mainland factory, and then make the footprint, all the things, and on the tubular in something like your exhibitions library. Yeah, and then when the designer come here, and then they will know that how to get it. And now, and I will extend this this library and divide some categories, something like the recycled material, biodegradable, bio-based, and also dissolvable materials, and also the green materials. And for now, if you say that there's sustainable materials, something like the people, especially the students, maybe for the design, they don't know what is the recyclable, biodegradable. They don't know the deeply definitions. So if we can archive all the material and separate the different kind sustainable material to the students and state the definitions to them, and then I think that it is so helpful for their project. Yeah, because maybe now they always will say that it is sustainable materials, but for our professor, and they will say it's just the eco material, because sustainable is mean that it's like a circle. Yeah, they will circular from the raw materials and then product, and then they will come back to more material to the factory, and maybe the green and also some students will ask me what is the green materials. Maybe just is non-toxic, and is maybe the wood, and you say the glass or something like that. Yeah, but and now our library will set up the new sustainable collections. Maybe if you have time, you can come here to see. Yeah.
Even the audience. Thanks, man. I know Ceci is somewhere in the background. We can't see if there is questions from the audience, but there might be some. Hi, hi, Ceci.
Hi, I couldn't see any question raised by the audience now.
Okay. Well, we certainly have more questions.
Yeah. So just so the audience can ask the questions, but we can type them. They can type them in. Yeah.
They can type them in the chat box. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, there's someone asked a question. What is the most unique, surprising thing about materials in Hong Kong that has arisen from this research?
From our research.
Yeah. So.
Or Lydia's research. You want to take that?
What is the most surprising thing?
Yeah.
I think it goes in two directions. One is maybe just responding to what Man had said a minute ago. It's like how little experience a lot of people working in the field do specifically have with materials, or how little willingness to experiment we can see, especially regionally. And I think that is sort of one of the things really after that we would like to take our students with us to look more thoroughly into how can you understand material innovation through very different means, you know. And I think that is part of how we compose this panel together today, because it is really coming from a very large scale, what Matthew partially describes in the book, to really hands-on experimenting with materials, what Lidia is referring to. And I think this this idea of hands-on is really also part of our work.
Yeah, and then maybe to add on to that, just for me, of discovery is just in the kind of lack of an archive already in Hong Kong about its local materials, which is maybe public and accessible by people. I think if you are working in Hong Kong to find out where, what is the soil material like, what are the specific qualities of the base layer of a site. It may have been studied before, but that material hasn't really been compiled in any kind of accessible way. And so you have this thing where people are constantly going back and digging up samples and evaluating them, instead of a kind of a resource which has been built up over time and exists for everyone to use and to build on top of, such as in a city like in Seoul, South Korea, where there's a much more public soil archive or kind of base material archive that informs a lot of planning, landscape architecture, and architecture without having to redo that work. And so I think one of the ambitions of our archive is to make as much stuff public as possible. And we're just at the beginning, and so that's a really small process, but I think it comes with that ambition to publicize and to get that material out there.
Yeah, and the question was a little bit about what's the most surprising, right? I think to keep it short, the surprising thing is that we sort of run a bit into open doors, like, oh, really, a materials library, but how come we don't have that, right? And I think it's also in the conversation with Man, who's curating a library which is specifically to design, but as mentioned at the beginning, Man has a fashion design background, and the spectrum of materials is much different. So we would like to augment that, to respond more to landscape or to site-specific materials, but of course also having this component of innovation and fabrication in there. Are there any more questions? Maybe we can take one last one.
I have a question if no one else does. I mean, I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. And obviously, we're all kind of working at this from different angles. But I would say we're all working at it, how do I say this? Kind of with not the same target audience, but at least a similar age of target audience. And I don't know, I think at least what I'm kind of, wanting is again, the sort of heightened awareness. And I think that comes from, actual engagement with the material, as we're all kind of talking about. I think we have some great examples of that. But it does seem like we need to sort of start this experimentation at a much younger age, or at least formalize that experimentation at a much younger age. Now, obviously, children already sort of have their own material experiments with mud pies and things like that. But yeah, I guess I wonder about, have you guys ever thought about how some of these ideas might actually be translated for, I don't know, a workshop with primary or secondary education kind of participants?
I think the most important thing is to create this kind of more participatory workflow when dealing with materiality. And yes, of course, there's things you need to have a certain training to be able to do, especially if also you're working with machines. But there's many different ways in which all age groups can participate, from very small kids to, let's say, elderly members of societies, and they can participate in creating and sourcing the material, first of all, which is very easy to do, in creating maps and points of interest in the city. They can participate not only in sourcing it, but on discovering where we can source it. So I definitely think it's maybe the most important thing to involve as many and as diverse people as possible. And again, because it's so hands-on, I think actually it's really easy to involve them. We just have to, I think as designers from different branches, as architects, as material scientists, sometimes we are trying to create things for the real world. but we live kind of detached from the real world. It's a privileged position to be into. And I think once we step out of that and we actually work with the people that we're trying to improve their lives, that could also be of interest to us. There's a lot to learn from that, from the unexperienced and untrained.
Okay, I see our clock is getting to 8 o'clock. Ceci, any more questions have popped up?
No, we don't have anyone.
Okay, so maybe we can conclude and thank our guests. One thing that has been coming up in my mind during the conversation is the reminder that so I'm a landscape architect, trained and teaching landscape architecture. Not everyone here is, but for landscape architecture, a reminder that this conversation about materials brings us back out to a very large scale when we work. I am reflecting on what I've told students this semester, that, you know, when they're analyzing a site, the watershed is the really important scale. And I'm thinking that when we start talking about building sites, that's completely wrong, because when we start bringing materials in, they're being extracted from much larger, they're influencing communities at a much wider, of course, global scale. And I think this talk has been a good reminder for me to really reinforce these kind of larger territorial global scales within the work that we do. And through materials, I think it gives it a really clear way to talk about that scale. It's not abstract at all to talk about material extraction, quarrying, waste, all of these things, which are quite actually, maybe the students don't have experience touching them, but they're quite tangible as concepts.
Yep.
So yeah, I want to thank the guests for those kind of reminders, and in my own teaching and work, and as we develop the lab, I think in the next phase, the innovative part of the lab, where students will be experimenting with materials and making their own materials. Susie, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think I would be happy to be in touch with all of you again in this next phase. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I think we can conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day, Matthew, and good night to our Hong Kong guests. And we'll continue the discussion. And I want to remind the audience that the exhibit is open until Sunday. So go have a look at PMQ Galleries and check out the website. Thanks very much again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.